The city building genre was defined by Will Wright's SimCity in 1989, a game that inspired many to create their own take on this idea, the idea of running a city, building it from the ground up, populating it, or at least getting people to come here and live, open up businesses, thrive, and give you the sense of accomplishment that you, yes you, have managed to create your own city, with roads, with public utilities, with everything that a real city needs. It inspired many to create their own takes on this idea, on this genre, on this fledgling concept of a game where you create a city. In a way, a life simulator, if you will, though at the time it really wasn't, but the genre did sort of go in that direction with the way that its inhabitants functioned, where they became less statistics and more statistics that would routinely ruin your plans, which is what life does. And some of the people that were inspired by SimCity happened to work at a studio called Impression Games, a company that in 1989 gave us a different take on the city building genre than what SimCity gave us, for better and for much worse in certain aspects. The idea was, why settle for the present? Why settle for running a city that you know of? A city where you live in? Yeah, there's value in that, but there can be more. You can add fantasy here, and not the fantasy you're thinking of, the fantasy of, dragons and magic and stuff. No, the fantasy of running a city in another time. Still realistic, still grounded in reality as much as 1992's hardware could achieve with the graphics back then. And what better time than the glorious Roman Empire? You wouldn't be Caesar, even though the game is called Caesar, but I think you would eventually get to that point where you would become emperor. You would start out by building your first settlement in a small province, erecting roads that will lead to Rome one day, building houses, making sure people had the basic necessities for living like water, food, that they weren't being killed by barbarians, and that they weren't on fire for some reason. Fire broke out a lot in these games, quite a lot. The first Caesar game had a couple of versions, and I don't mean just that it had a version on the Amiga and then one for DOS. No, even on DOS there were two games, and both of them are available on GOG right now in a single package that you select once you get into the actual game. There is the US version and the European version. The European one is noticeably harder to play because there are no tooltips, there is no map, and here's something that I never actually thought about. This is the only version of Caesar, of any of the games that I remember, that mentions slavery outside of the intro. Yeah, there's slavery mentioned in the intro to Caesar 4, but here it's actually a factor in the game. You have slaves doing all the labor. It's not an assumption. You see the word slave, and one of the servants in the forum is kind of what you would think of as a slave from the American perspective, even though the Romans sort of didn't just enslave Northern Africans, they enslaved everybody, which is actually what kind of led to the downfall of the empire, because the rich people had slaves working pretty much anywhere, and the citizens of Rome were out of a job and penniless and really wanted riots. The US version has tooltips, has an automap, and removes any mention of slavery. Slaves are replaced by the plebs. And again, I don't think that any of the later games, I'm still a bit fuzzy about Caesar 4, ever brings back the slavery angle. Not saying slavery is good, but it was an important factor of Rome and an important part of its downfall. So having it there and be a factor in the evolution of the city and the inevitable fall of it would still be an interesting mechanic, which you kind of know that probably not a lot of people are gonna touch in the near future. Kind of surprised Fallout is still getting away with it. Regardless, Caesar was a game that people enjoyed, probably more on the Amiga because, everything was better on the Amiga. Playing it now, so many years after it was first released, it is kind of a pain. Even the US version, which does have tooltips, the controls are kind of awkward. It just doesn't have the elegance that SimCity had. It doesn't flow as well. Though for a first attempt, and for its time, it is a good enough game, I would say. It was good enough so that they actually felt they could do a sequel. And Impression Games didn't just rush out and create another one instantly. No, they actually took their time, hired a guy by the name of Chris Beatrice as art director, and in 1995 released Caesar 2. Caesar 2 was a massive step up from the previous game. The graphics for one were a lot more legible. You could understand things a lot easier with it not being stuck in a top-down perspective that was sort of taken from SimCity 1. It instead had a more skewed approach, a more isometric-ish kind of perspective that SimCity 2000 has. But it was a looker, and most of all, it tried to not be like all the other city builder games that were cropping up from time to time. And it did so with the walker system. This is still a bit of a controversial point because on one hand the walker system is a nice idea. I mean, instead of having buildings just radiate their effect around them, you actually have people coming out of that building and taking the effect to the houses nearby. So if you have a prefecture somewhere which is needed to make sure that things don't catch on fire, then you'll actually have the prefect walk around the street, and where he finds something that looks like it's gonna catch on fire, he's gonna make sure it doesn't. Now this may be next to the prefecture, it may be on the other side of the map until, you know, the prefect got tired and turned back home. And it's like this with every building in the game. It's a superb idea with one tiny problem. Because it's meant to simulate the agency of the people that would be working in those buildings, they would often do things you didn't want to, like not go where they are needed and just spin around and get lost and in general make your city crumble. And you would see this constantly as your city sort of flourished for a while, then because one guy did not go where he was supposed to, a part of your population left. Now there is no one actually able to man certain buildings efficiently, so those don't work, so more people leave, and then everything resets to zero. Then you plant more houses and then other people come in and it works again for a while, and then it sort of breaks down. Now this does have an advantage to it actually. It means that things do not become stale. Well, they don't become stale quickly. You're gonna have to fine-tune your city quite a lot to reach the exact perfect formula where it will not break down. And even then, there is some random event because you pissed off some god, because there's gods in these games that can be ticked off because you don't worship them. Something will happen and bam, you're back to square one. Well, not square one, but at least you're gonna have to rethink things. One of the features that I truly miss from this series that Caesar 2 brought was the zoom function. You could zoom in and zoom out. Even though this was a DOS game running at a fixed resolution, had this feature been implemented in the later games, let you zoom in and out, playing something like Pharaoh now at 4K would not be horrible. Caesar 2 was a massive step up from its predecessor. It improved basically everything. You were no longer just building some city, you were basically constructing province by province an entire empire and then becoming you yourself emperor, you becoming Caesar, unless you fail, you know, because you couldn't do things. One thing I keep forgetting to mention about these games is the combat, and I'm gonna come back to it even for Caesar 1. It does have combat up to a certain point. Caesar 1 actually had combat that would be interfaceable with a different game published by Impression called Cohort 2, which was a sort of real-time strategy Roman-based fighting game. And Caesar 2 had its own limited scope of combat. It's what really set this apart compared to SimCity because it had combat in it. A kind of combat that was never good. This is valid up until the end of Impression games. Well, I haven't gotten to Emperor yet, so let's say until this point it's valid. Combat in these games was more or less superficial. It was more about, do you have units? Yes. Okay, you probably won. You don't have units? Okay, you lost. It's not what you would call in-depth, and it was never really fixed for the games that would come. And games, would absolutely come, because Caesar 2, according to the figure I found on Wikipedia, sold 2.5 million copies. This to remind you that there was a time when city builder games were amazing and people bought them in the millions, and this again was 1995. It was a time when development of games wasn't in the hundreds of millions. It was something that could really make a studio's day. Well, had they been an indie studio, but by this time Impression was already bought out by Sierra, because Sierra saw what they were making with Caesar 2 and said, you know what, this thing will probably be amazing. And hey, it was. Like, their bet paid off big time. And because the wait time between 1 and 2 proved to be a good idea to make a great game that sold well, they did the same between 2 and 3. So we had to wait another 3 years to get a new edition. There's a problem with the GOG version of the game, because Caesar 1 doesn't have any numbers in it. It's Caesar 1, it's Caesar, simple. Caesar 2 has a Roman numeral, but Caesar 3 is a number, like number of Arabian origin, not Roman origin. But that bit aside, Caesar 3 was as much of an improvement on 2 as 2 was on 1. Well, okay, maybe not as much, because the perspective was still the same and the graphics were an upgrade, a significant upgrade, but they weren't super duper improved. You even lost the ability to zoom in and out, which was kind of sad. But you did get other features. You got talking characters that you could click on, your villagers, the people in your city, in your town. You could click on them and you would hear what they had to say. They would comment on things. Actually, I think they commented in the second one, but now they commented a lot. You had vastly improved interface design with easier than ever to use controls and overlays to show you exactly what the problems were in your city. You had everything at your fingertips and you could enjoy just building out a town and pulling out your hair, because the walker system is a boy. This was in the age of Impression games when they still sort of didn't figure out that the walker system sort of needed a bit more of a ability for the player to direct things. To a point, the series never actually got there. Yeah, you had blockers where you plumb this in, nobody goes past it. But you could have used things like, you plumb this here, nobody but X goes past it. Or you plumb this here, nobody but Y goes past it. Which would have been a really neat feature, especially now that buildings don't just get workers from a general pool of unemployed. They actually have to go to the houses of the people, knock on their door and say, hey, you want to work? Get over here. Otherwise it would not function. This was something that was still in the series at Pharaoh, though there I didn't find it as annoying, because it was enough for them to find one single house to basically have access to the entire pool of workers. But what really kind of ticked me off about Caesar 3, and this was the first game of the series that I played, came in the form of the aqueducts. On the one hand, they looked superb. Making a city that had aqueducts properly arranged in an ornamental way just sort of gave it a gravitas. It gave it a certain sense of style, a certain sense of Roman architecture, of venerable majesty, if you will, that you don't see very often. I mean, aqueducts, like who else besides Romans had them to that degree, at least in these games? No one, probably for a good reason. For example, you could not build them over roads. Aqueducts had very tiny feet, very closely bunched up together, so you couldn't actually build them over roads, meaning that you couldn't have an aqueduct spanning the entire map, or at least most of the map, some of the map, part of the map, because the game also had the idea that you couldn't interrupt access between one corner of the map and the other, where the entrance and exit to the map were, which were used by trade and by people from time to time. So unless you built your city with that in mind, you would on occasion see how bits of your aqueducts disappear and leave your people without water, because the game decided to, now I want to allow access to the highway by demolishing this bit. And you could also lock in access to the provinces, to the world map where people can come in and go out, by placing buildings near rocks. I just kind of wish that people could, when they come in, they could just squeeze in somewhere in a corner border, like between the road and the buildings. Like, there's room, but the game disagreed. Still, visually, it is a superbly looking game, and once you get used to its quirks, you do find a really deep and very pleasant game. Again, one with kind of horrible combat. By instinct, I sort of avoided all the combat missions in this game, but those are easy. In your progression towards becoming Caesar, you are offered the choice of either participating in missions that require more combat, that are more focused on fighting against the barbarian invaders, or you can handle more economy-focused tasks, with their own missions that tend to be actually the hardest of all, because after all, this is a city builder. It's in the building of a city where the difficulty lies. And yes, although building a city and maintaining an army can be difficult, the challenge of those missions was actually lower somehow. Caesar 3 was, up until I found Zeus, the one I played the most. I don't think I ever finished it, but still I enjoyed it quite a lot. Just building something that could rival Rome. A prosperous city with enough food for everyone, with a coliseum where people would go and enjoy gladiator battles, with a hippodrome where horses would race and there were dolphins for some reason counting the laps, with temples, with oracles, and with the occasional total failure of the distribution network because somebody went in the wrong direction and wandered almost off the map. And it have interaction with the other regions of the map. Not a lot though, it's still a primitive interaction, which again, up until Emperor, which I have not played fully yet, was never really all that evolved, all that great. Yeah, you could invade in some of the games, you could trade, you could make them vassals, but it just felt like it was underused, always underused. Unlike the engine that Caesar brought, the one with no zoom, which maybe became a bit too overused for its own good in the next couple of years. And I'm gonna get to those in the next couple of weeks actually. I already did Pharaoh last year or 2 years ago, I forget which, so I'm not gonna be covering Pharaoh again. I pretty much said everything I could say about that game in that show, but I will be covering Zeus and Emperor now that I actually have it, and we'll be playing it over the next couple of weeks. And then, well, I have two options before me. I can do Caesar 4, about which I had some mixed feelings when it came out, but a new perspective on it wouldn't hurt. And depending on what answer I get from an email I sent to someone that I mentioned in the show, I may have a different subject. As to what it'll be, well, you're gonna have to wait until the end of the month to see. Till then, you can find the entire Caesar series on GOG. Hell, you can find the entire Impression Games City Building library on GOG, currently for the price of 46 euros, which is kind of a lot. And honestly, if you're just in it for Caesar, you pretty much only need to buy Caesar 3. As I said, it's an improvement over 2, even though it lacks the zoom feature. But 1 and 2 really don't have all that much to offer. Yeah, the series kind of lost a bit of its charm when it removed actual physical representations for your council, the forum, the advisors. I mean, now they're just tabs on a screen, and they remain tabs on a screen until the end of the series. But apart from that, Caesar 3 is kind of the best of the Caesar line up until 4, to which I may get or not at the end of the month. Well, technically next month, but still, I will do that or something different. So if you want Caesar 3, you can get it on GOG right now for around $5, $6 actually, it's €5 and a bit. Or you could wait for a sale like I did, there was one actually last week, and get all of them for half the price. Your call. Goodbye.